The lunch meeting at the Beverly Hills Hotel, spring of 1956, was supposed to be about contract renewals. Instead, it became the moment when Harry Cohn, head of Columbia Pictures, decided to remind Marilyn Monroe exactly how expendable she was. He'd heard something, a rumor that traveled fast through certain circles, and he wanted her to know he knew. The dining room was full of industry people pretending not to watch their table. Cohn waited until the waiter left before he leaned forward, his voice pleasant but precise, and said the kind of thing that sounds like concern but lands like a threat. These stories don't make it into the official biographies. If you want to hear what really happened behind the carefully managed image of old Hollywood, subscribe now. Some truths were never meant to be comfortable. Marilyn had arrived on time, dressed simply, her publicist seated 2 tables away as instructed. Cohn was expansive at first, talking about box office numbers and potential projects, the kind of conversation that feels like approval until you realize it's all conditional. He ordered for both of them without asking. She noticed but said nothing. There was a rhythm to these meetings, a performance both sides understood. She smiled when expected, nodded at the right moments, kept her posture relaxed. It was easier that way, usually. The shift came after the appetizers arrived. Cohn's tone changed in that subtle way powerful men use when they want you to know the real conversation is starting. He mentioned a name, Lionel Hampton's pianist, a young man named Eddie, talented but unknown, someone who'd recently gotten a recording contract that seemed, in Cohn's words, surprisingly well-funded for someone with his background. The emphasis on background was deliberate. Marilyn felt her stomach tighten, but kept her expression neutral. She'd learned that much at least. Never show them when they've landed a hit. She'd met Eddie 6 months earlier, at a private jam session in a basement club on Central Avenue, the kind of place studio heads never went, where musicians played after their official gigs ended. She'd gone with a friend who knew the scene, someone who understood she needed places where she could disappear into the music instead of being looked at. Eddie had been playing that night, and afterward they'd talked about Chopin, about structure and improvisation, about how training could free you instead of limit you. He'd mentioned casually that he'd been trying to get a proper recording for years, but no label would take the risk. The word risk had meant something specific, and they both knew it. 3 weeks later, she'd made a phone call. Not directly, she'd learned to be careful, but through someone who knew someone who handled these things quietly. She'd arranged for a fund, anonymous, enough to cover studio time, and pressing costs for a small label willing to take Eddie seriously. The money came from her own accounts, routed carefully through a lawyer she trusted. It wasn't charity. It was simply removing an obstacle that shouldn't have existed in the first place. She'd asked for one condition. Her name stayed out of it entirely. Eddie would never know where the support came from. That was essential. This wasn't about gratitude or publicity. It was about what was right. But someone had talked, or someone had noticed the paper trail, or someone had put together the pieces and decided this information was valuable. Now Cohn knew, and worse, he was telling her that he knew in a room full of people who'd spread it everywhere by evening. He didn't say it directly at first. He just kept circling the subject, making observations about certain types of causes and how actors who got involved in social matters tended to find their careers suddenly complicated. The word complicated hung in the air like smoke. Marilyn cut a piece of salmon she had no intention of eating. Her mind was racing, but her hands were steady. She was calculating, not just what Cohn knew, but what he planned to do with it. And more importantly, why he was bothering to tell her now. The answer came quickly. He was scared. Not of her, but of something. Maybe she'd turned down a project he needed her for. Maybe she'd been talking to other studios. Maybe he just needed to reassert control because he felt it slipping. Whatever the reason, he'd chosen this method, this weapon. He'd gone after something good she'd done and was trying to make it feel shameful. Eddie's very talented, she said quietly, setting down her fork. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't an explanation. It was a statement of fact, delivered in the same tone she'd used to comment on the weather. Cohn's eyes narrowed slightly. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. She was supposed to panic, to deny, to beg him not to spread this around. Instead, she'd just confirmed it and offered nothing else. The silence stretched out. Someone at a nearby table laughed too loudly at something. The sound felt out of place. Cone leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting to something meant to look fatherly. "Marilyn," he said, using her first name like a reprimand. "You don't understand how this looks. There are people in this town, important people, who are very sensitive about these things. You start getting involved in integration movements, civil rights, whatever you want to call it, and suddenly you're not America's sweetheart anymore. You're a problem. You're political. Nobody wants political. They want the girl on the calendar." She felt the words land where he intended them to. The girl on the calendar. The thing she'd been trying to escape for years. The reduction of everything she was into a single image that could be bought and sold. He was reminding her that this was still how he saw her, how the industry saw her, how they'd always see her if she stepped out of the lines they'd drawn. The cruelty wasn't in the volume. His voice had actually gotten softer. It was in the precision. He knew exactly which parts of her past to invoke to make her feel small. What he didn't know was that she'd already survived worse than his disapproval. The foster homes where she'd learned to read people's moods before they turned dangerous. The photographers who'd made it clear what they expected in exchange for the shots that might lead somewhere. The executives who'd treated her like property with a shelf life. She'd come through all of that by learning when to bend and when to hold her ground. This was a moment for the latter. She could feel it with absolute certainty. "Eddie got that contract because he's extraordinary," she said, her voice level and clear. "If that makes me political, then I suppose I am." She picked up her water glass, took a slow sip, and met Cone's eyes over the rim. There was no challenge in her expression, no defiance for its own sake. Just a calm refusal to pretend this conversation was what he wanted it to be. She wasn't going to apologize. She wasn't going to scramble to manage his feelings. She was simply stating what had happened and leaving him to do what he wanted with that information. The moment hung there, suspended. Cone's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to this, to someone not immediately backing down when he applied pressure, especially not from her. The entire power dynamic of the lunch had been built on the assumption that she needed his approval more than he needed hers. But something in her posture, in her willingness to let the silence sit there heavy between them, suggested that maybe that assumption was wrong. Maybe she'd already calculated what this would cost and decided she could afford it. "You're making a mistake," Cone said finally, his voice harder now, the pretense of friendliness gone. "This will follow you. People will remember." It was a threat without being an explicit one, the kind of warning that was designed to sound like concern. But Marilyn heard it for what it was, a promise to make things difficult, to quietly spread the story in ways that would make her seem radical or naive or worse, to make sure casting directors and producers knew she was trouble, to use every lever of power he had to punish her for this small act of decency. She stood up, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the clear intention of ending this meeting on her terms. "Then I hope they remember it correctly," she said. She picked up her purse, gave him a brief, professional smile, and walked out of the dining room. She didn't rush. She didn't look back. She could feel eyes following her, could sense the buzz starting even before she reached the door. By tonight, this would be all over town. By tomorrow, it would be a problem. She knew that. She'd chosen it anyway. Her publicist caught up with her in the lobby, his face already tight with concern. "What happened in there?" he asked, trying to keep his voice low. Cone looked furious. Marilyn kept walking toward the exit, her heels clicking steadily on the marble floor. "He is," she said simply. "It doesn't change anything." The publicist started to argue. About optics, about timing, about how they couldn't afford this kind of controversy right now. But she held up a hand to stop him. She was done explaining herself for today. The calls started that afternoon. Her agent panicked. A producer she'd been in talks with suddenly distant. A columnist who wanted a quote about the rumors. Each call was its own small crisis, its own reminder of how quickly things could shift when you lost the goodwill of powerful men. Marilyn listened to them all with a strange sense of detachment. This was the cost, she thought. This was what it actually took to do something that mattered. Not the money. That had been easy. The real cost was this. The uncertainty, the fear. The knowledge that she'd just made her already complicated career significantly harder. But when she allowed herself to think about Eddie, about him walking into a studio with real resources, real support, the ability to make something that might actually reach people. She found she didn't regret it. The system was wrong. That much was obvious to anyone willing to look. Talented people were being locked out because of nothing more than the color of their skin, and everyone in the industry knew it and accepted it as natural. She'd had a chance to chip away at that, even just slightly, and she'd taken it. If that made her naive or political or difficult, so be it. The story did spread, just as Cohn had implied it would. But it spread in strange ways, through channels she hadn't expected. Some of it was hostile. Conservative columnists questioning her judgment, studio people making it clear she'd crossed a line. But some of it was different. She started getting letters from musicians she'd never met, thanking her for understanding something most people in her position didn't even see. A few actors, ones who'd been quietly supporting integration efforts for years, reached out to let her know she wasn't alone. It wasn't widespread. It wasn't enough to counter the professional damage, but it was there. Eddie's record came out 4 months later. It didn't become a hit. The distribution was too limited, the promotion too modest. But musicians noticed it. Critics noticed it. It opened doors that had been closed before, not all the way, but enough. He'd go on to work with some of the biggest names in jazz, would be remembered as a bridge between bebop and the more experimental sounds that came later. Years afterward, someone would mention to him, carefully, that Marilyn Monroe had been involved in getting his first session funded. He'd asked if she wanted him to thank her publicly. The answer had come back, no. That was the point. For Marilyn, the consequences weren't immediate or dramatic. There was no blacklist, no official ban, just a cooling. Projects that had seemed certain became uncertain. Directors who'd been eager started hedging. The roles that came her way were smaller or required her to fight harder for them. She understood what was happening. This was how power worked in Hollywood. Not through confrontation, but through 1,000 small decisions that added up to a career trajectory bending downward instead of up. The strange thing was, she found she could live with it. Not easily. There were nights when the fear came back, when she'd lie awake wondering if she'd destroyed everything she'd worked for over one act of conscience. But in the morning, the decision still felt right. She'd spent so much of her life being handled, managed, told what to do and who to be. This had been hers. She'd seen something wrong and she'd acted on it, knowing the price. That felt like something worth protecting. The moment that made it clear the industry's attitude had shifted came 6 months later at a party in Bel Air. A producer she'd worked with before, someone who'd always been friendly, pulled her aside and told her, with genuine regret, that she wasn't being considered for a role she'd been perfect for. "It's the political thing," he said, as if that explained everything. "Some of the money guys are nervous. They think you're unpredictable now." Unpredictable. That was the word they used when you stopped being completely controllable. She'd thanked him for telling her directly and excused herself to the garden. It was the kind of California evening that felt designed to mock interior distress, everything soft and golden and perfect. She thought about all the ways this would have been easier if she'd just kept her head down, if she'd let Eddie struggle on his own, told herself it wasn't her problem, focused on protecting her own position. That was what most people did. That was how you survived in a system built on looking away. But she'd never been good at looking away. Maybe it was growing up on the outside of everything, watching how power moved and who it crushed. Maybe it was just stubbornness, that part of her that refused to accept the world as it was presented. Either way, she'd made her choice, and she was learning to live with what that choice meant. The career she'd have would be different from the one she'd imagined. Maybe smaller, maybe shorter, but it would be hers in a way that mattered. Eddie's second album came out the following year. By then, the connection to Marilyn was known in certain circles, whispered about but never confirmed officially. Some people thought it made her seem radical. Others thought it made her seem naive. A smaller group thought it made her seem brave. Marilyn herself rarely talked about it, even with people she trusted. It had never been about credit or recognition. It had been about using what little power she had to make something slightly less unfair. The professional costs continued. Roles that would have come to her automatically now went to others. Directors who'd wanted to work with her suddenly had concerns about focus or reliability. Code words for the real issue. She knew her career was narrowing, that the window of opportunity that existed for actresses, especially ones who'd been typecast as thoroughly as she had, was closing faster now. The connection to Eddie's story wasn't the only cause, but it was part of the calculation studios made when they decided whether she was worth the investment. What changed, gradually, and in ways that were hard to measure, was how she was seen by a particular segment of the industry. The writers, the character actors, the musicians, the people who existed on the margins and understood what it meant to be excluded. They treated her differently afterward. Not obviously, not in ways that would draw attention, but there was a shift, a recognition. She'd put something on the line. She'd taken a risk that actually mattered, that created a kind of respect that couldn't be manufactured or bought. Cohn had been right about one thing. People did remember. Years later, when obituaries were written and biographies were compiled, this story would appear, usually in footnotes, sometimes expanded into a chapter, would be framed as evidence of her political consciousness, or her generosity, or her naivety, depending on who was doing the framing. But the people who'd been there, who'd watched how quickly Hollywood could turn on someone for stepping outside acceptable boundaries, understood what it had actually meant. It had been a quiet act of conscience that came with a real price. The last time Marilyn saw Cohn, it was at a premiere 3 years later. They were both older, both slightly diminished from where they'd been. He nodded at her across the lobby, a brief acknowledgement that carried no warmth but also no active hostility. The moment had passed into history. He'd moved on to other battles, other starlets to manage and control. She understood then that for him, the lunch at the Beverly Hills Hotel had been one of 1,000 power plays, instantly forgotten as soon as the next crisis emerged. But for her, it had been something else. It had been the moment she chose principle over protection, consequence over comfort. It had been the moment she learned that having power meant nothing if you weren't willing to risk it for something that mattered. Most people never learned that. They went through their entire careers playing it safe, protecting their positions, never testing whether their influence could be used for anything beyond advancing themselves. She tested it. The answer had been complicated and costly, and ultimately worth it. Eddie kept playing until his hands gave out in the late 70s. By then, he was respected, recorded, remembered as part of the generation that had transformed jazz from entertainment into art. He'd tell interviewers, when asked about his influences, that he'd been lucky, that he'd gotten chances other talented musicians hadn't, that someone had believed in him when it wasn't fashionable or safe to do so. He never mentioned Marilyn by name unless pressed. When he did, he'd get quiet, choosing his words carefully, trying to explain what it had meant to have that kind of support when the industry's doors were closed. In Marilyn's later years, when the roles stopped coming and the industry had moved on to younger faces, she'd occasionally get asked about the Eddie story by journalists who'd heard pieces of it. She'd confirm the basic facts without elaborating. Yes, she'd helped fund his first proper recording. No, she didn't regret it. Yes, it had affected her career. She'd say these things plainly, without seeking sympathy or credit. It had simply been something that happened, a choice she'd made when choices still mattered. The truth that emerged slowly, as people who'd been in those rooms began writing their own memoirs, was that the lunch with Cohn had marked a turning point in how Marilyn was perceived behind closed doors. She was no longer just the sex symbol who needed managing. She was someone with convictions, someone who couldn't be entirely predicted or controlled. That made her dangerous in ways the industry couldn't easily categorize. Some executives avoided working with her afterward. Others, a smaller but more interesting group, sought her out precisely because of that unpredictability. What got lost in most tellings of this story was the simplest part. She'd seen someone talented being denied opportunity for reasons that had nothing to do with talent, and she'd done something about it. There was no grand political awakening, no conversion to activism, just a recognition that the system was wrong and she had the means to work around it, at least once. That she'd paid for that decision didn't make it less worth doing. It just made it honest. The final assessment of what that lunch meeting cost her professionally would take decades to calculate. How many roles didn't materialize because of it? How many directors decided she was too complicated? How many opportunities evaporated because someone remembered she'd been political about integration? The numbers could never be precise. But what could be measured by those who cared to look was what she'd gained. A reputation among the people who mattered for the right reasons, as someone who'd stood up when it would have been easier to sit down. In the end, the story of Marilyn Monroe and Eddie the pianist became one of those pieces of Hollywood history that revealed more in its details than its broad strokes. It showed how power worked, how quickly support could turn to isolation, how much it cost to do the right thing when the right thing wasn't popular. It showed that courage didn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looked like a quiet phone call, an anonymous fund, a willingness to accept consequences that others wouldn't even consider. That kind of courage didn't make headlines, but it changed lives. And for the people whose lives it changed, that was everything.